chickens and some different things. And the league overall in Georgia over the past 6 or 8 months has been taking a tact into practical preparedness and practical methods for independence and liberty. And what Joe has to say fits perfectly in what our whole theme has been in all of our educational programs for the past year, at least. Because I know our head school dealt with that. Our national meeting is going to deal with it. Our state meeting dealt with it. Matter of fact, I think the title for the national meeting, which is going to be in Abbeville this year, Ed, Abbeville, South Carolina, the seat of secession. And they now actually have a historical marker on Secession Hill in Abbeville. I went and saw them dedicate that thing last Thanksgiving, Old South Thanksgiving. But anyway, I want y'all to pay real close attention to what Joe has to say. Now, you weren't there where you read. Middle Georgia.
Not
yeah. Oh, you're going to enjoy this. You're going to enjoy this. Really. And I never in my life ever thought that I would be interested in bees. But since I listened to Joe's talk a couple weeks ago, I got on the internet on Google Books. Does anybody know what that is? I've downloaded 40-something books on beekeeping. Some of them are back in the early 1800s. Way back when. And it's fascinating. And anyway, y'all pay good close attention to Joe, and I'm sure what he's got to say you'll find of interest. I promise you that. It's all yours, buddy. I'm done. I didn't have a bio on this, so I couldn't run the gamut there.
Well, thanks for having me again. Learned a little bit of a lesson in coming to speak here. I kept those old notes in my truck for about 4 or 5 days, and I said, well, who else wants to hear a speech on local economies and the independence mindset? So I chunked them, and 2 days later I got a call and said, would you give that speech again? So I had to do my homework all over again. And I told our chapter that it's good to be in the league. Outside of the pulpit, there's nowhere else I'd rather be. And in my opinion, the Westminster Confession of Larger Catechism, rather than the Confession of Faith, the Westminster Larger Catechism section on the Ten Commandments is by far the best work ever done on Christian ethics outside of the Scriptures. And it begins with question 142 by asking, what are the sins forbidden in the 8th commandment? And the answer is that the sins forbidden in the 8th commandment, besides the neglect of the duties required, are theft, robbery, man-stealing, and receiving anything that is stolen, fraudulent dealing, false weights and measures, removing landmarks, injustice and unfaithfulness in contracts between man and man or in matters of trust, oppression, extortion, usury, bribery, vexatious lawsuits, unjust enclosures, and depopulations. Then it says this, engrossing commodities to enhance the price. It goes on and on and on. There's other things. And as I read those violations of the 8th commandment and I think about the engrossing of commodities, the false weights and measures, the extortion and oppression, of course I couldn't help but to think about the big corporations and their entanglement with government, and the fact that we are by forced into an unjust system, this unfairly set against the local economy, unfairly given advantages over mom and pop type enterprises in favor of big multinational corporations, and especially this engrossing of commodities to enhance the price. Before, as we were eating this evening, we talked about corn and corn subsidies for ethanol, and in effect the government pays farmers to produce corn cheaper than they can really produce it in order to give big corporations a purchase on corn way below what the market price would bear. And in doing so, they engross all the commodities to the big corporations and then drive the cost up for everybody else. After the corporations have gotten the cheap corn that the taxpayers have subsidized, they've engrossed it, driven the cost up, so that now corn is about almost $7 a pound for feed corn. which is just ridiculous. So we had this engrossing of commodities by our government, driving up costs, depleting food supplies, and a systematic effort by these multinational global corporations to legally, according to international law and federal law, to legally control our food supply, to control and own, really patent and own the food, life. For the first time in history, life is patented, and they're doing that through the courts and through the patent office. The U.S. Patent Office has never in its history allowed the patenting of life because there's too many variables. It's not an invention, it's life. And life happens through cross-pollination and all these various other means. But we now have this engineered food that has been patented and is owned by corporations. And it spreads like wildfire. It is... been proven over and over again to pollinate at further distances, and it's just getting in all the food supply. So now you have these corporations, these companies who are owning our food supply. And to give one example, Clarence Thomas, Supreme Court Justice, was Monsanto's lawyer before he sat on the Supreme Court. And so every time a case comes before the Supreme Court, he's not recusing himself. He sits there and he rules on those cases. A lawyer for Monsanto. So they have this inside advantage with government and stocking all the branches of government, every area, all these federal agencies with their men. And then they work against us. And so we had this engrossing of commodities by our government. And something we hear about a lot today is to think globally. We need to think globally. We live in a global economy. Everything's global. I mean, nothing is local. We're really beyond nationalism. It's just everything is global. We're part of the global community. And so what are the dangers to thinking globally? Can we think globally? Is it good to think globally? There is in places around the world starvation and hunger. We need to think globally. We need to sacrifice for these people. That's what they tell us. That's what we hear. But I would argue that it's just the opposite. That thinking globally and operating globally really impoverishes local communities in favor of this supposed global good, which they really set up this false dichotomy between local and global, as if we can sacrifice local good for a global good. Local good is global good. If localities do well, then the world does well. But when we begin to think globally, you have all kinds of problems that arise. And Wendell Berry makes this quote. He makes this statement: "Properly speaking, global thinking is not possible. Those who have thought globally have done so by means too extreme to merit the name of thought. Global thinkers have been and will be dangerous people. National thinkers tend to be dangerous also. We now have national thinkers in the northeastern U.S. who look on Kentucky as a garbage dump. A landfill in my county now receives daily many truckloads of garbage from New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania." And he says that's apparently acceptable to everybody except those who live in this county. So what you have now, when you have this a global economy, or even a national thinking nationally, is that one section of the nation begins to look on another section of the nation as a garbage dump. They're just something to be exploited. And so the people in that county have many daily truckloads of garbage pouring into their county because these national thinkers, these global thinkers. And you have the danger of the fact that it removes accountability further and further and further from the people that are most affected by it. So that when you have global thinking or national thinking, nobody cares what happens in Barnesville. And there's no accountability for that. They're so far removed from Barnesville at this point that we can't really hold them accountable. You have one government in D.C. that's so far removed from the rest of the nation, such a vast land. I don't know how many square miles of land it is, but it's too big of a place to govern. Now, when you go a step further to think globally, how can we hold multinational companies accountable? What laws do they fall under? International laws, federal laws, state laws. Where do they fit in? How many levels of greed and tyranny do we have to go through to hold these companies accountable? I'm not sure that it can happen. Then the means of production are removed so far. We talked on the way up about the fact that not a single pair of jeans are made in this country anymore, and that's bad enough. But when you begin to think about your food supply and how far removed that is, that gets scary. And for instance, this statistic: the typical carrot has traveled 1,838 miles to get to your dinner table. Well, how are you going to hold them accountable for salmonella or E. coli or anything else when they're 1,800 miles away and far removed, and you're not even sure what farm it came from, who farmed it, where did it all start? You can't track it down. In fact, I watched a movie I highly recommend to you, Food Inc., as in Food Incorporated. But this guy, he set out to see where his food started with, and he said, I kept winding up in a cornfield in Iowa. Well, it took a lot of work to keep tracking his food to a cornfield in Iowa to find out that even his ketchup is really corn. But then you wind up with these multinational corporations who've bought up all of Iowa. How's he going to hold them accountable when he lives in Florida or California or wherever he's from, and they're in the Midwest, and then come to find out they're not really there, they're in Europe or wherever else they are. And so thinking globally removes accountability further and further and further away from the people that are most affected by their bad decisions. It makes it difficult for us to research the safety of those companies. What's their track record? What are they doing? Who do they support? What do they do? It's hard to track all of that down. But most dangerous, I think, is to think globally. It causes even us and everybody else to view communities not as made up of people, but as a commodity to be exploited, something to be exploited. We can either dump our garbage there, or they have some product that we need, and so we can swoop in on them and use that up and exploit that benefit from them and be done with them. We've gotten what we need. And so to think globally, it makes communities to be viewed as a profit center or a dump or whatever else we're going to do with them. And really, this idea that if we think globally we can reduce world hunger, I think is proven over and over and over again to be a fallacy. World hunger has increased rather than decreased. We're not doing anything to help world hunger. We're just, again, exploiting these local communities that have their own culture and their own ways. One headline from the Boston Globe, I think, proves that. It says, over the last 9 months, global food prices have soared 40%, while food reserves are at a 30-year low. Now, all we hear about today is with new genetically modified seeds, with new Roundup Ready corn, soybeans, and alfalfa, and everything else, with new mechanical means of farming, that the average farmer can feed far more people per acre than he used to. And he can farm far much more land than his grandfather used to. And yet right here we hear that foods, from the Boston Globe of all places, that food supplies are at a 30-year low. With all of this supposedly increase in farming, why is that? Well, it's because they're engrossing the commodities that they produce. They drive up the costs for the average person while supplying low-cost foods for all these big companies. For instance, Purdue gets their corn and their feeds at such, it's not because they have a bigger price point because they buy more, it's because they get in on the front end, and so they buy food at such a ridiculously low price that they can produce chicken below the cost that chicken can be produced. But then you and I can't compete with that. It's just not even possible. Not even a big company can compete with those prices. And an example of all of this interaction between these corporations and government to force us into their system, to drive out local economies, to break that liberty and freedom and independent mindset that comes from being a part of a community, we have Monsanto. We talked about them, and this isn't a bash against Monsanto talk. There's other companies, but Monsanto's the most well known. And the fact is that these multinationals are in bed with our government. I mean, they're in bed together. They're in bed with our regulatory agencies. In fact, our regulatory agencies have basically become subsidiaries of the multinationals. They work for them. They stock the people. So much so that in an in-house newsletter in the year 2000, Monsanto made this statement: agricultural biotechnology, you need to read that as frankenfoods, genetically modified foods that are unsafe and unhealthy. Agricultural biotechnology will find a supporter occupying the White House next year, regardless of which candidate wins the election in November. Didn't matter. Democrat, Republican, didn't matter. They had a friend for genetically modified foods in the White House. We said that Clarence Thomas was Monsanto's lawyer prior to being the Supreme Court judge. The U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Ann Veneman, was the board of directors at a Monsanto subsidiary, one of their companies. The Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, was on the board of directors at Monsanto's pharmaceutical subsidiary. And interestingly enough, after I said this a couple weeks ago, after we invaded Iraq, took over the company and set up the rules and regulations, right on cue, our Secretary of Defense made it impossible, illegal, with prison sentences for any Iraqi who saved seeds from one year to the next. Now, that didn't have to be a Monsanto seed. That didn't have to be a patented seed, a Roundup Ready seed, any genetically. That could have been an Iraqi heirloom from 1,000 years ago that was not infected with Monsanto seeds. They could not legally save those seeds from year to year. They must buy them from U.S.-based seed companies. So that's what you get when you get these officials who are sent to Washington from the multinationals. The U.S. Secretary of Health, Tommy Thompson, received $50,000 in donations from Monsanto as he during his campaign winning the governorship of Wisconsin. Two congressmen receiving the most donations from Monsanto during the last election was the chairman of the House Agricultural Committee and Attorney General John Ashcroft. So why those two guys? Well, if you've got the Attorney General in your pocket, nobody can bring a suit against you and be successful. No small farmer can come up and stand against you and bring a suit because you infected their seed supply with Monsanto seeds. In fact, it's to this point, the government has said, contrary to all past laws and history, for instance, if I have a cow, you have a cornfield, it is my responsibility to keep my cow in my pasture. If my cow breaks through the fence and he comes and he decimates your cornfield, I'm responsible. I'm the owner of the cow. He didn't stay in my confined space. I've got to buy your corn. Well, the government has effectively said for Monsanto that now you are responsible to keep my cow out of your cornfield. In other words, if I have an infected seed, it's not my responsibility to keep that in my field. But if it infects your field, Monsanto, or me, if I'm Monsanto, I now own your field of corn. And you now owe me penalties and fines, excessive penalties and fines, because you allow my corn seed to pollinate yours. And we've tracked it down, and it's there. Monsanto has consistently and continually won a suit after suit after suit where they trespass illegally, steal a man's seed, it tests positive for their genetically modified organisms, and they have won. They have driven those men out of business. One man in particular, a seed cleaner, was driven out of business and forced by the government to hand over his client list to Monsanto so they could track down anyone he had cleaned seeds for, and then go to those fields and test those for genetically modified organisms. One man in particular, the government awarded Monsanto somewhere in the neighborhood of $350,000 fine because right along the edge of the road he found Roundup Ready soybeans. They trespassed and found Roundup Ready soybeans. He found the man who had delivered seeds in a semi who testified in court that his tarp had broken and enough seed blew out around that curve to seed 2,000 acres of soybeans that they blew into that man's field. Testified in court. The court ruled the man still owed about $350,000 to Monsanto for patent infringement on their seeds. So that's the kind of thing that we're dealing with this entanglement of multinationals with the federal government. Now, I would argue from that this is a fairly dangerous situation. You have companies whose sole purpose is to take control of the food supply, to own the world's food supply. And so at very best, this makes our federal agencies, because they're just stocked and filled in their positions by these companies, it makes them at very best obsolete. And at worst, it makes them taxpayers, subsidized subsidiaries of these companies, so that we basically fund these companies to do their studies. One case in particular, there was a lady, I didn't have time to write it down, can't think of her name. She worked for Monsanto. It was her job to write a report on the safety of genetically modified foods and the different health consequences of that. She wrote the report. Before it was submitted, she was sent to Washington to be the head of the FDA, and it was her first job. First task on the job was to then review her own report and approve it or disapprove it. So she obviously approved that, and without any further study, they were allowed into our food supply. So it's dangerous. It's dangerous in the fact that we are allowing things like the Terminator gene to be released upon us. To end all seed production. No one can save seed. It's ridiculous. Monsanto's spokesman said that it is not Monsanto's job to verify, test, or be concerned about the safety of their products. Their job is to sell as much as they possibly can sell. He said that it is the FDA's job to test and approve the safety of their products, which would be fine and good if it wasn't that they had just stocked the FDA with all of Monsanto's people. One person in particular has been on the Monsanto board, FDA board, Monsanto board, FDA board, back to Monsanto 3 times. So they just go back and forth until they get what they want passed, and they're making a killing. So it's a serious risk to our liberties. The food supply is a serious risk to our liberties. It's fascism. It's ridiculous. It's unheard of in the history of the world that people would own the food supply. Now that's the major things. You have some things, I don't want to call them minor, but maybe a little less serious. For instance, a Walmart or a Lowe's would like to come to Barnesville. Well, they don't have the privilege of, like everybody else, of paying property taxes. They get their property a lot of times at very discounted rates. They don't have to pay property taxes. So if I want to open up a little mom and pop a store that sells a few clothes or groceries or whatever else I want to sell, how can I compete with a Walmart who doesn't have any of the same fees, and they don't have to go downtown 85 times and pay $400 for this license, that license, to build this and do that. All of those fees are waived for them to come in for their supposed help of the local economy, when it's been proven time after time that it's really the small people who do actually have the biggest impact on local economies, because Walmart's money's gone. They make it, it's gone. If a mom and pop makes a profit in this town, it stays in this town. Their profit does. So you have those sorts of things. You have things like this. A while back, maybe last summer or fall, you had the big salmonella fear with the eggs. You had all these contaminated eggs everywhere. Those came from big companies. That company, I think, was one of the top 5 egg producers or something to that effect. So that company then writes and proposes and sends to Washington a food safety bill. That food safety bill really doesn't apply to that company. It only applies to the small people. So that I am not legally allowed to sell you my eggs unless you show up at my doorstep. I can't sell you eggs here. I can't deliver eggs to you. I can't sell them in a store, though I've never had salmonella in my eggs. This company, who has salmonella in the worst cases maybe ever, now writes a food safety bill that says that I have to go through more restrictions to sell my eggs, but they don't. And so that's how it works, and it's dangerous, it's wicked, it's ungodly, and it's in a violation of the 8th commandment, in my opinion. So what are the solutions? I think the solutions are strong local economies. I think that we have too often thought of local economies only in a defensive posture. You know, if everything goes down, if it all hits the fan, if we have strong local economies, we can make it. But I think the key is that strong local economies foster a mindset of independence, liberty, freedom. I think you could track that back to the War for Independence. We had a strong economy. People began to feel like, why should we pay things into the British Crown when we're providing all for ourselves? And what trade we have is because of our strong local economy that allows us to trade. What really are we benefiting from the Crown with what all we have? And so that it began to foster, along with a lot of other factors, it began to foster a mindset of independence. We don't need them. You look at the war between the states. You had a strong agricultural economy. We had trade set up with Europe. We didn't need the northern states to trade with. We had a much better deal going. So there was not this economic tie that made us feel like we need to stay in this union. So that strong economy allowed people, fostered in people's mind, a driving desire for liberty, to be free from them. We don't need to pay high tariffs to them. We trade with Europe. We don't even trade with them. So the more we strengthen our local economies, I think the more people in our communities, even people who might not think like us in a lot of areas, will begin to wonder, what are we paying for? What are we getting out of all of this? And they'll have a desire, a driving desire, to be free from it. We get all we need right here locally. And so it's an offensive tool. We can go on the offensive. I think the government sees it as a threat as well. I think that's why they crack down on it every chance they get. I didn't have the quote with me, but there's bills now seeking to make bartering illegal. After the Liberty Dollar incident, they have proposed. There have been laws proposed to make bartering illegal, so that I can't swap my honey for a league hat because no money swapped hands and no taxes was paid. So they see that as a threat, and I think by forcing them into, we force their hand really when we build strong economies. We force them, one, to either ratchet up their oppression so that people that sit on the fence say, hey, that's a little strong, heavy-handed. Maybe we need to look at this. Or we force them to back down and say, I think the people are getting a little irritated with us cracking down on these things and we need to back off. So one or two ways. We either cause them to back off or we cause them to go full force. And that, I think, has the benefit of getting people off the fence, making them choose sides. And I think they're biding their time. And they have things that they want to accomplish, and they're not accomplished now because they don't feel like they have everything in place. So if we can force them to go faster than their plan, that's in our favor, I think. That's a little aside. So what I would say to build strong economies is we need to produce more than we produce. As individuals, as communities, and we'll get into a couple of those specifics. But what we cannot produce ourselves, we do need to be looking for local suppliers. We need to be looking for local foods, local everything, really. Now, there's some things that can't be had local. They come from wherever. But it's better to buy those things from local mom and pop people, even at a higher price, because even though the principle of that is maybe going out of state, out of country, whatever, that profit is staying there in the community. When you buy from Lowe's, it's gone. But if you go buy lumber from the mom and pop store, well, the principal amount for that lumber may go, but the profits stay. So what I'm arguing is, what we can't produce, we need to find local supplies and suppliers for those things. And we can expect to pay more for them. But what's liberty worth? Is it worth you paying a 20% higher for a 2x4? Mm-hmm. I mean, is that worth it? I think it is. I think I think it's worth it to me just to have somebody that knows my name when I walk in the store, to get that customer support and all of that. So we need to be willing to pay more for those things. You're going to pay more for eggs because I can't buy corn at a ridiculously low rate like Purdue can. Or Tyson or whoever else. So you can expect to pay more for local things, but I think it's worth it. I think we need to do it. So I was going to talk just briefly about the 3 things that I do. I said last time, these probably are not the most strategically important things you can do to produce or support your local economy, but they're the 3 things that I'm doing that I found to be profitable, at least in the sense that I can do it cheaper, a little cheaper than I can buy it for, so I'm at least saving some money. And I think they're things that these are the basics that everybody should be producing. That 100 years ago, everybody did produce these things. Nobody went to the store hardly and bought eggs. Everybody had chickens. So some of those things. So the first thing is a vegetable garden. And of course that's easy. A lot of people do some vegetable garden. Almost everybody does a tomato or two, except Ed, who can't grow tomatoes in his soil. But vegetable garden is important, even if you can't do a lot of it. I mean, in other words, if you're doing 3 tomato plants you have for the past few years, why not add 3 squash plants to that, or whatever you like? In other words, let's just try and do a little more. Let's just try and maybe double, or at least go up 25% production on those things. A good reason for it is I went to the grocery store the other day. A green bell pepper is $1.19 for a bell pepper.
$1.99 a while back.
Yeah, that's absurd. So that's something we can do to protect our money, to hedge against inflation, to have some production for ourselves. It needs to be done. I mean, it needs to be done. We need to be growing something. But let's say we don't have any land. What are we going to do? If we can't grow a vegetable garden, we just can't do it. Well, go to your local market. And I don't mean the state-run market in Macon, but find some of these little markets that are springing up. There's one in Macon on Mulberry now. There's one in Warner Robins, where these people are the farmers, producers. Nothing's purchased from Florida and brought in and sold at a higher price. These are the producers. They're bringing it in. They're selling it. Yeah, they're selling it at a little higher price. And maybe you feel like you could get it cheaper and just do as well just to go to Walmart and get it. But I would argue this. Defensively, if things do get bad, if we haven't supported these guys now, they're not going to have the infrastructure in place to do it then. But if you can pay them a little more for your bell pepper, for your lettuce, for your carrots, whatever, then they have the means to expand and grow and grow and grow and get those things in place, and we need that. So vegetable garden, that's number 1. Number 2 is chickens for both eggs and meat. Protein is important. Eggs are a great source of protein. That's easy enough. Everybody knows chickens and eggs. That needs to be done. But the one thing I really want to talk about is something that I've tried this year and have been fairly successful with and found it to be easy with no time consumption, is meat chickens. I used scrap lumber that I had laying around, all different sizes, built my pen kind of according to what I had. Wendell saw it today. I've got about $45 in a portable chicken tractor that's 5 by 10 by 3 feet tall. I got $45 in the wire. That's the only thing I didn't have. That's holding 20 chickens right now comfortably. I can get 35 in there easily. And it takes me 10 minutes a day at the most to go out, throw a little bit of grain in, slide it forward 10 feet to fresh grass. Those chickens I use are Cornish crosses. They grow for every 2 pounds of food that they consume, they put on a pound of weight. They're ready to dress out. They'll dress out at about 5.5 pounds at 8 weeks old, which is even if you live in a neighborhood at 8 weeks old, they don't cluck, they don't crow, they make no noise. By sliding it every day, there's no odor. The grass is unbelievably fertile behind it. I mean, in a day, it's an inch taller. I mean, you can see the whole. I mean, it's unbelievable what they do. And when I can move them through my garden, that's going to be even better. So that's something easy to do. You can do it. My neighbors have no idea that they're there. And I just glide them around. I've used way more land than I need to do it. I mean, I've just made a little course instead of going back and forth over the same patch of ground. But anyway, I bring this up. We talked about this on the way up here as well. A report came out this week that 52% of all meat in the United States tests positive for antibiotic-resistant superdrugs, staph, and everything else. And they defined a superbug as resistant to 6 different categories or classes of antibiotics. 52% from 80 different meat companies in 160 different national grocery store chains. That's frightening. The antibiotics levels are so low that they've become resistant. There's a lady in the movie Food Inc. She's a chicken farmer, and because of all the antibiotics in the feed that she feeds, she has an antibiotic allergy. She can no longer take antibiotics or it'll kill her. And we eat that. We continually eat that. That doesn't cook out of the food. You can kill superbugs if you cook it properly. If you can't kill those antibiotics in the food, we're eating those on a daily basis, and it's frightening what they feed us. It's really frightening. I have a friend who's a chicken farmer. I can't express to you the filthiness of that place. The companies, the new law is they have to put these foam things up over the window. So a meat chicken, when you eat a meat chicken, he has never in his lifetime, except from the chicken house to the slaughterhouse, he's never seen daylight. He's never seen daylight. He breathes fecal dust all day long with numerous respiratory problems. He's unhealthy, and it's really horrendous. So meat chickens, I would highly recommend you do meat chickens. I think you can do them for 80 cents a pound. I think when it's all said and done, you might have, outside of the butchering, you might have an hour in the whole process. I said 10 minutes. I do it probably 5 minutes a day. Each morning before work, I move it forward, I top off the feed, and I'm done. You could do it if your backyard was twice the size of this room. You could do it easily. Do meat chickens to 8 weeks. So anyway, that's the meat chickens. If anybody's interested, I got 2 hatchery websites where they can be purchased. The cheapest I've found anywhere for the Cornish crosses. And the last thing I want to talk about is bees. A lot of people don't think about bees as being the big, that's not the big survival preparedness type thing you need to do. But I think the bees are pretty important for a lot of reasons. Number one, they pollinate your garden. So if you're going to have a garden, well, why not have something to synergistically boost that garden up and help pollinate it and grow it? But secondly is that during the Great Depression, bees became extremely valuable. Sugar was rare, a little bit hard to find, expensive when it could be found. Up until the Great Depression, there was no beekeeping industry as such. There were beekeepers, but it wasn't the business that it is. But sugar, cane sugar and other things were not being imported, and so it became the booming business that we know today. It kind of boosted that up and organized it a little bit. But of course, then, and I was reading today, it said, but everybody knew a tree that they could go and rob. They knew a tree where there was a bee tree hollowed out and there were bees, and they could go smoke them out and rob the honey from it. Well, that's not the case today. You have all kind of foreign insects, parasites. You have hive beetles, you have mites, you have colony collapse and everything else, so that there just aren't any feral bees left. I don't know of any feral bee. I've never seen a feral bee colony, not at least in the last 2 or 3 years that I've been fooling with bees. No feral bees at all that I know of. Nobody that I have worked bees with has run into any feral colonies lately. So there's no bee trees to rob, is what I'm saying. Sugar is needed. We need it for various things, but it's something that, at least in the past times when things have been bad, the price of honey has gone up. It has been a sought out item. It's something at least to have, to barter and trade with and work with, and it's beneficial for a lot of things. Of course, like we said, the better pollination for the garden. But a little bit of a note about sustainability and organic. You hear those terms a lot, and you'll notice that I didn't use the term sustainable or organic. My meat chickens are not sustainable. They're a cross that I can't produce. They don't produce to themselves because they grow so large so fast. They just don't reproduce themselves. You have to make that cross. Of course, sustainability and organic is an end goal. We need to be sustainable in these things. But what I would argue for in the strengthening of our economy, local economies, is let's take some baby steps along the way. I kind of have the mentality of, I'm going to get it all right now. I'm full on organic. I'm going for it. Well, that's all good until some pest comes and demolishes your garden, and then you got nothing. So what I would argue for is start working with what you have and start applying some of those principles. For instance, in the garden, let's don't say, hey, we're not going to use any pesticides this year. You might get a bug. You might need to use a few pesticides because we haven't done this for a long time, and it takes a while to turn something over to organic. But what you can do is start using some principles that will help you. For instance, don't plant all your tomatoes together in the same patch. I plant 3 or 4 tomatoes. I may plant 5 or 6 squash, a few peppers, then I do some more tomatoes. And what that does is it keeps pests from just hopping from plant to plant to plant, because it's not likely that whatever wears out your tomatoes is going to wear out your peppers. And so you can kind of break, they may find it, but you kind of break up that cycle. So in other words, what I'm saying is start applying a few principles of organic gardening, but don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Just take some baby steps and wean ourselves off of the system that we know so well. With the chickens, there are more sustainable chickens out there. The Delaware is a better, more sustainable chicken than the Cornish cross. But they take 12 weeks to grow out. They take a little longer. They're not quite as cost effective. They're not quite shaped the same as the chicken you buy in the store. So your wife might not quite feel comfortable about eating it like she would the Cornish cross that she's used to. So just taking some baby steps. I'm not sustainable on my meat chickens, but in a year or two, maybe I will be. But in the meantime, I'm taking those steps to reach that without throwing it all away, and in an effort to be fully sustainable right from the start. We can work within the system and wean ourselves off the system and strengthen our local economies, and thereby strengthen people's desire to be free from this behemoth that occupies us now. That's it.
Will you take any questions?
Yeah, sure.
I recall that a couple of weeks ago we started out talking about the usual self-sufficiency frame of mind for when the matter hitting the fan, and that you're talking from a different angle. I just would like to for you to, if you can reverbalize that.
Yeah, I think that I do think that building strong local economies is not just defensive, but it's offensive. I think it puts us on the offensive. It makes us proactive. We're not just sitting back waiting for something to happen, but we're active, we're working, we're moving, and we're stirring up a desire for freedom and all of that, while at the same time preparing for any, whether it be economic collapse or whatever may come that could harm us. But it builds a sense of community with people, so they feel a little more connected. Most people are very transient. Most people aren't born and raised within a few miles of their home like they were maybe even 50 years ago or 100 years ago. People just come and go. There's no sense of connectedness to this town or to my town. But when you build that strong sense of community, people, I think, are a little more attached to the land, a little more attached to that community. They have a little more a sense of ownership in it, and when people from the outside start forcing their way in, that makes people get a little more defensive. But if people have no attachment to a community, they could care less what happens, because they'll just move to the next. They'll just move to the next town where the next best job offer comes along. So I think there is a two-edged sword to building local economies, certainly.
These Cornish crosses, they just don't, genetically, they don't cluck or crow or?
Well, they don't reach the age to cluck or crow.
Oh, because you kill them first.
They're at 8 weeks. They're ready to dress. A male chicken won't crow till a cockerel won't crow till he's nearly 6 months old, and these are butchered at 2 months. Hens don't cluck until they begin to lay, which is roughly 5 or 6 months old. And so these chickens are you never hear these chickens at my house.
The other question is, this may be the same thing, they're just too young, but they don't like fight and try to kill each other and all that. Like a lot of times you have them, it really could be closed spaces.
Right.
Chickens can be kind of needy.
Yeah, they're not. There's a little bit of pecking at the feed pan from time to time, but really because they're not sexually mature yet, they're not that way. Mine have a little over 2 square feet per bird. I think the specs, if you get them from the chicken companies, is roughly 1 square foot per bird. Chicken houses are about 1 per square foot, which is filthy in a chicken house because they sit there all day. You could really crowd them more in a pasture poultry model because you're constantly moving it. You can be more productive in that sense than the chicken houses. They drop a lot of fertilizer, and what I mean is I move it every morning. If you leave it 2 days, it'll burn the grass out.
Yeah, he don't burn his grass.
Well,
You can see his path.
It moves if he left it there, like you said, for a couple of days.
You're constantly moving it.
Yeah.
You get just enough.
So your coop is on wheels essentially.
Well, what I did is I just framed it out of 2x4s and some scrap stuff. And what I did in the back, and you couldn't see it, is on that back 2x4, I took some Schedule 40 PVC and I cut it in half with a jigsaw, and I screwed that to the back so that it's almost like a little sled. And I have a rope, a handle with a piece of PVC that I grab, and I just slide it forward. It's not a lot of effort. I don't think my boy could probably not pull it just yet. He could pull it, but I don't think he could control it enough not to run over the slower chickens. It's literally, as long as it takes you probably to grab this table and move it the length of the table. The top's not connected, it's a completely separate frame. Just slide the top open and pour the feed in, and I'm done. The water is a 7-gallon bucket on the top with a hole and a hose that runs through to a little pan, and so I don't even have to fill it up with water but about every 3 or 4 days. So really I probably at the very most have 5 minutes a day.
Who does all your chicken plucking?
I do all my chicken plucking.
You seen that chicken plucker on YouTube?
The whiz bang chicken plucker.
Yeah.
I got that in the works.
Hey, you guys got to just go to YouTube and look at this. This thing's the coolest redneck thing I've ever
So
seen.
you pluck it, you slaughter them and everything?
Right.
Do you sell your meat, man? Or, I mean, y'all don't eat all of it.
Legally, I can't sell meat because the regulations are that the FDA will be glad to come and you have to have a federal agent come and supervise the safety of that, and they'll be glad to do that at any chicken processing plant you so choose to use, so long as you produce 500,000 birds at a time. Otherwise, you can't sell birds publicly. So they've knocked out any small local competition. So technically, I don't sell any chicken meat.
It's
The safest, best
It's
chicken
amazing
meat
that the
you could
FDA had to
possibly
look
buy
at
is this one.
That's right.
one of those places where
And I'll say this for the chicken: you'll be surprised at the difference in the meat. A chicken, whereas a cow, for instance, you get 100% grass. They don't need any grain. A chicken does need grain. Their stomachs are such that they need some grain. But a chicken will eat about 20% of its food from grass, about 20% from bugs and insects, and the rest is grain of various sorts. It's a very much different tasting chicken. And my wife, who wouldn't eat brown eggs for the first 6 months that we had chickens because they weren't white, tasted these chickens and said, that is extremely juicy and tender. She said that is very. She still don't eat dark meat of any kind, even if store-bought chicken. She only eats white meat. And she said that is the juiciest, most tender chicken I think I've ever tasted. It's a little different texture, a lot of different taste. The meat looks better. It looks healthier in the color, and even after it's cooked, it looks better. But it's a different texture. Whereas, for instance, a store-bought chicken is often tender and juicy, but flavorless, so you have to marinate it or put some sort of rub on it. This chicken has flavor. It tastes, I mean, it's hard to quite describe it, but it's different, and it's a lot better, I think. A lot better.
You got your wife to eat venison?
Yes, I did break her into that. It did took a little while, but I've turned her into a country girl, I think, against her will. So,
Where's she from?
She grew up actually a mile from our house right now, but she just never had home cooking really. For the first year of our marriage, she argued with me over and over that canned vegetables taste better than fresh vegetables. But now she would say I was crazy. That was, fresh vegetables are better. So if my wife will eat these chickens, your wife will eat these chickens, I'm sure.
As long as my wife doesn't have.
As long as you don't name them.
As long as you don't know them. Now my son Eli, he's out there asking questions like, now what part of the leg am I going to eat? Is that yellow part, or do I got to get those feathers off to eat that thing?
Yeah. John, he needs to help you make that chicken plucker thing.
That's right.
That's the coolest thing.
Yes, sir.
Okay, you get eggs too, right?
Right. I have 2 different types of chickens for the eggs. That's another sustainability issue. Go ahead with your question.
Where do you keep those chickens? You don't keep them with those.
No, those chickens are in a coop that stays in the same spot, and I just open the door and let them out.
You have them in a pen.
Yeah, I have them in a coop, and then I just let them roam the yard, in the evenings to get their grass and bugs and everything else. But
they come back to the coop at night.
yeah, they go to bed early.
Does fox or chicken hawk ever get in?
Yeah, I lose a few from time to time, but that's just the price you pay for eating fresh grass, I guess. And it makes a difference in the eggs. I know y'all know, but we've cracked them side by side, store-bought eggs, which an eggshell, this is another issue. An eggshell's porous. Whatever's on the outside is going to get on the inside. And white eggs, they spray with I don't know what it is, chlorine or something to bleach them. And so that gets in there. And on top of that, a store-bought eggshell is the most pitiful thing I've ever seen. I mean, they crack with ease, so they're very porous. Whereas our eggs, you can't hard boil them until they're about 3 weeks old, or you won't ever get the thing peeled. The shell's so much better, so much healthier, and less porous. But in a frying pan, when you crack a store-bought egg, it's very pale, pasty looking yellow yolk. It's flat, and it spreads out over the pan. When you crack one of our eggs, they stand up at attention. I mean, they're high, everything's compacted right there, and it looks like it's almost an orangey color yolk, and it tastes like cheese eggs without adding any cheese to them. And the same thing that makes grass green is what makes that yolk that brighter color. And so they need to be out getting grass. And here's the other thing. At the store, and I don't want to tell me when we need to stop here, but at the store, they put things on the package like free range. That's absurd. Free range means that chicken house was however many hundreds of feet long. Those chickens were in there on the floor, and at the far end, there's an opening about this big, and if the chicken wants to go out, he can. Now, he's never going to go out. And if he goes out, it's just dirt in most cases. And they consider a free range egg at the store. That's legally the term free range. If he would like to go out, he can. That's a big difference in a chicken that's free to eat grass and green and bugs and everything else that he might want to scratch around.
How long does fresh eggs, how long are they good for?
6 weeks at least. We've eaten them past 6 weeks at our house. I think they last longer when they eat green stuff. But the test is if you put it in water, if it stands up, it's bad, because the older it gets, the more air it gets, and that air stands it up. So a fresh egg will always lay lay sideways. Now at the store, they're already 7 or 8 days old when you get them, and well past being bad. Plus, it's not good for an egg to be shaken. That makes them go bad a lot. That's why you don't really put them in the door of the refrigerator. Well, that egg's been shaken to high heavens. It's worked down a conveyor, just jostled along. It's been sprayed. It's been rough handled. It's been put on a truck. It's traveled. It's delivered into the store. That thing is no good by the time it gets to the store. The other thing, too, on both the meat and the chickens, meat and the eggs, is when they eat grass and bugs, the omega-3, 6, and 9s, and all of those things are almost double a regular grain-fed chicken. The B vitamins are way more, which are stress vitamins, really. So B vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin D, all of those things are much more elevated in grass-fed beef, chicken, and eggs. So it's not just a matter of no antibiotics. That's a big plus, because a meat chicken gets antibiotics from day 1 to the final day. I mean, when they come to harvest them, they're still eating antibiotics as they're loading them in the trucks. But that would be big enough if we just didn't have those antibiotics in the food supply. But the fact is that the B vitamins, A vitamins, vitamin E, and all your omega fatty acids are way elevated in grass-fed meat and eggs. Yeah. And on the honey, the other thing real quick is store-bought honey. I may have talked about it before you got here, Red, is they pasteurize it, kill it, so it's dead and lifeless. Whereas local raw honey is not. It's antibacterial. People use it like Neosporin, and it leaves less scar, and they found on burn victims than antibiotic creams and all this other stuff. But which you probably know some of that. But anyway, just a lot. There's a big difference in eating raw honey and pasteurized honey. The raw honey never goes bad, ever. 1,000 years. They found honey in the pyramids and things that is crystallized and solid, and they've heated it up and tested it with no bacteria. I mean, it's edible. But store-bought honey, it goes rancid. But it never crystallizes. It'll stay liquid forever. But it goes rancid and turns bad. So, anyway.
Kill it like do milk.
Thank you.
Thank you.